China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. You know, I'm usually not in the personal advice business, but here's a free one. Delete your TikTok account. That's because TikTok is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And if you use TikTok, the Chinese Communist Party now has a ridiculous amount of data on you. TikTok is owned by a Chinese company called ByteDance. They have a Chinese version of TikTok called Douyin. It's like TikTok, just more censored. How much control does China have on TikTok? I'd say about this much. And TikTok collects a lot of data on you. Here's just a partial
Death is nature's way.
You may notice that includes keystrokes. TikTok could use that to capture personal user information like credit card numbers and passwords, though the company claims it doesn't do that. TikTok does say in its privacy policy that it reads direct messages. It also says it could turn over your information to the government if there's an inquiry. And they're probably not just talking about the US government. In its privacy policy, TikTok also says it collects information about your approximate location and, with users' permission, also precise location data, such as GPS. And in December, TikTok admitted that ByteDance was using the app to track journalists' locations, specifically US-based journalists who were reporting on TikTok and ByteDance, which is bad news because BuzzFeed got a hold of leaked audio recordings of internal TikTok meetings, and American user data has been repeatedly accessed from China. In fact, everything is seen in China. That shouldn't be a surprise to users who actually read TikTok's privacy policy, though. It says right there in black and white that we may share all of the information we collect with a parent, subsidiary, or other affiliate of our corporate group. So why is China using TikTok like this? I'll explain after the break. Welcome back. TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, is under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, and they're literally trying to control how you think. TikTok's CEO said last June that ByteDance engineers around the world may assist in developing TikTok algorithms. And using those algorithms, TikTok censors information the Chinese Communist Party would rather you not know. That includes content related to certain world leaders, Tiananmen Square, Tibetan independence, and Falun Gong, as well as highly controversial topics like China's genocide of Uyghurs. In 2019, TikTok was forced to apologize to a teenager for deleting her video about Uyghur genocide. The video looked like a makeup tutorial, but several seconds into it, she starts talking about the genocide. The video was viewed more than 1.5 million times before her entire account was blocked. TikTok said it was due to human error and reinstated her account shortly after. I assume they considered it human error, not banning her before her video went viral. Now, TikTok says none of its content moderators are based in China. However, it admits that China-based ByteDance plays a role in the hiring of key personnel at TikTok. In fact, according to LinkedIn, 300 of their employees used to work for Chinese state-run media, and some still do. That includes 50 employees working with TikTok. According to former employees, China was actively censoring content on TikTok. Former US employees said moderators based in Beijing still had the final call on whether flagged videos were approved. A number of executives reportedly left TikTok after discovering that Chinese employees were mostly calling the shots. The US government is taking action. In December, Congress passed a bill banning TikTok on all government devices. Some US states have done the same. And maybe someday, the US government will completely ban TikTok, like India did more than 2 years ago, after Chinese soldiers killed Indian troops. So if you're still a user of TikTok, let us know in the comments below why. If you're not, let us know what you thought about this episode. And now I'll answer a question from a fan of the show who supports us on the crowdfunding website Patreon. Ian Pendleton asks, how bad would it be for the CCP if the U.S. decided to remove any and all state-owned businesses and corporations from the New York Stock Exchange, regardless of whether or not they can be audited. Well, Ian, last year, 5 Chinese state-owned companies delisted from the New York Stock Exchange, because otherwise they would have to let U.S. regulators audit their books. They voluntarily delisted. Most people never heard of it, which is to say it did not cause the world to explode. But there are still more than 200 Chinese companies, some of which are state-owned, on U.S. stock exchanges. That's too many for the Chinese Communist Party to lose. And that's why the party finally caved and allowed U.S. regulators to access the audits of these Chinese companies. Previously, China said those were state secrets. If Chinese state-owned companies were forced to delist from Wall Street, this would be a good thing for Americans in the long term, because it would mean Americans would be less tied to the success of a genocidal regime. But the CCP wants American money, so it won't delist its companies unless it absolutely has to. And sadly, some Wall Street investors will not pull their money out unless they absolutely have to. Thanks for your question, Ian. And thank you to everyone who supports us on Patreon, because that's the main way we fund this show. Visit patreon.com/China Uncensored. Contribute $0 per episode and you'll get cool perks, including being able to ask me questions I'll answer on the show. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching China Uncensored. More illegal Chinese police stations are uncovered around the world. Some countries are investigating them, but others are defending them. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Looking for love in the new year? Then I recommend you check out this very important video on our new channel, Gamers and Beer, How I Found and Lost Love in Minecraft. Look, YouTube demonetizes us a lot. We have to get around it somehow. So, the Chinese Communist Party is being exposed for what it calls Chinese Overseas Police Service Stations. The CCP says that they are for persuading Chinese citizens who've supposedly committed crimes in China or abroad, such as scams and environmental crimes, to come back home. You know, just some friendly neighborhood persuasion. They also claim that overseas police help with things like renewing a Chinese driver's license and patrolling places with a lot of Chinese tourists. China isn't the only country to ever do this. After 9/11, the NYPD set up overseas bureaus to investigate terrorism. There's a big difference. Many of these Chinese overseas police stations were established without permission from the countries they're in, and potentially in violation of international law. Their excuse? Extradition rules are very cumbersome. What's wrong with simply pressuring criminals to return to China and skipping all the red tape? I mean, I bet they didn't make Spider-Man fill out a bunch of annoying paperwork when he went to Europe. And what's wrong with enforcing justice? If by justice you mean allowing an authoritarian regime that targets political and religious dissidents to pressure people to return to China, what's wrong with that? I've covered in previous episodes how 2 Chinese counties called Qingtian and Fuzhou set up local law enforcement branches abroad. This was exposed by the human rights NGO Safeguard Defenders. After their report, at least 13 countries started to investigate. Some even ordered China to close the police stations down. If you want to learn more about the findings and responses to Safeguard Defenders' initial report, I'll leave those links in the description below. Back when Safeguard Defenders first reported
That will be
in
balanced
September,
out.
they counted 54 overseas Chinese police stations across 5 continents. But in their follow-up report, Patrol and Persuade, they found almost double the number of police stations. In addition to the previously revealed 54 stations, there are at least 48 additional Chinese overseas police stations, bringing the total to 102 across 53 countries. Something that came from China is now spreading uncontrollably. Say what you want about the Chinese Communist Party, but at least they're consistent. Most of these newly discovered police stations came from two more counties in China, Nantong and Wenzhou. At least 29 countries were found to have police from Nantong, and 9 countries were found to have police from Wenzhou. These police stations are like high fructose corn syrup. Once you learn about it and start paying attention, you realize it's in everything. Both of those two counties started setting up overseas police stations in 2016. And it wasn't really kept secret. Chinese state-run media had openly reported about Nantong and Wenzhou's overseas police stations for years. This directly refutes the Chinese Communist Party's claims that the operation started in response to COVID-19. What's scary is that we're still just touching the tip of the iceberg. I mean, this is only the 3rd episode I'm doing about it. Probably a lot more than just 4 Chinese counties have overseas police presence. We just don't know about it yet. But here's the crazy part. Despite all this being revealed over the last few months, some countries are still in complete denial. I'll tell you more after the break. Welcome back. There are a lot more overseas Chinese police stations abroad than we knew about a few months ago. For the most part, they were set up secretly, without the host country actually hosting them. But in some cases, the countries were like, yeah, come on in. For example, Italy. It's the host of the largest number of Chinese police stations found so far. I don't know if that means Italy loves authoritarian police, or authoritarian police love spaghetti. When Shelley was in Italy in 2019, investigating Chinese sweatshops in one city called Prato, nearly everyone was from Wenzhou, one of the China counties with overseas police stations. But those police clearly didn't stop prostitution or gambling. Italy had also set up joint police patrols with Chinese police in Rome, Milan, and, yes, Prato. But after the latest negative publicity about overseas Chinese police stations, Italy Interior Minister announced that they had stopped the joint police patrols with China. Other countries, like Serbia and Croatia, have also signed police agreements with China, including joint police patrols. It's in the name of helping Chinese tourists and creating a safer environment.
Bi još bolje osigurati bezbednost građana naše dve zemlje, kineska i srpska vlada odlučile su da formiraju zajedničke policijske patrole. To ne samo da pokazuje da je saradnja dve zemlje u oblasti sprovođenja zakona dostigla jedan novi nivo, nego i u potpunosti održava ideju naše dve vlade o upravljanju radi naroda.
8 Chinese police officers have started a joint patrol with their Croatian counterparts in major tourist spots in Zagreb. It is a part of the Safe Tourist Destination project which started in 2006, and since then it has seen many foreign police officers coming to Croatia every summer to deal with tourist-related cases with their local colleagues.
The first day we came here, we met 3 Chinese tourists. I feel we are very welcomed by them because they feel really safe when they saw the Chinese policemen in uniform.
Ah, yes, I'm totally sure all those Chinese people who left China feel safe knowing that Chinese police are still watching them. In response to Safeguard Defender's latest report, Serbia and Croatia denied that there was any secret Chinese police presence by saying it wasn't a secret. According to Serbia's Interior Ministry, Serbia's memorandum with China dictates that Chinese police officers help protect public order and security. But Chinese officers don't have the right to use coercive force. Oh, of course. We should definitely trust an authoritarian regime like China to follow its own agreements. They totally don't do things behind other countries' backs. Serbia is in denial, saying such statements and unfounded claims harm the relations between the two countries of Serbia and China, as well as the cooperation that has always been at a high level. What kind of response is that? That'd be like if you came home at 4 a.m. covered in perfume and glitter, your girlfriend asked if you went to a strip club, and you said, such statements and unfounded claims harm our relations. Croatia is in denial too. According to Croatia's Interior Ministry, there's no data on the existence or operation of illegal police stations in Croatia. So don't worry. After all, Chinese police officers are only in Croatia to help facilitate communication with Chinese tourists for 1 month each summer. They totally wouldn't do more than just that, right? I mean, when has China ever thought about settling somewhere they weren't welcome? It's no surprise that Serbia and Croatia are trying to downplay the threat of overseas Chinese police. Both countries joined the 17+1 initiative to expand cooperation between Eastern European countries and China. But as Safeguard Defender notes, Chinese overseas police threaten other countries' sovereignty and the safety of their own citizens. New information shows at least one illegal persuasion to return operation run through the Wenzhou station in Paris, France, and at least 80 cases where the Nantong overseas police system assisted in the capture and/or persuasion to return operation. This is in addition to already exposed operations in Spain and Serbia. And despite China's long history of economic coercion and exploitation, Serbia and Croatia want to deepen economic ties with China. I guess Chinese money is made from rays of sunlight. That's the only way I can explain why everyone is constantly blinded by it. And now, as a thank you to all my wonderful fans who support China Uncensored, the crowdfunding website Patreon or the exclusive social media platform Locals, I'll answer one of your questions. Today's question comes from Nick Allen 1 on Locals. What do you guys think about live streaming a 3-body problem watch party on Rumble and Locals when the series launches on Netflix? Have any of you guys read the book? Did you catch the logical mistake in the premise? The book posits a dangerous universe where technologically advanced civilizations are doomed to destroy each other due to resource scarcity. But civilizations that advanced would easily overcome resource scarcity. I haven't finished the series yet, so maybe the author figures that out before Thanos snaps his fingers and doubles the universe's resources. Well, Nick Allen 1, I have read the 3-body problem books. If you're saying the first book makes a logical mistake, just wait till you finish the third one. But I won't spoil it for people that can read. For those of you who don't know, the 3-body problem is the first in a series of 3 sci-fi books written by Chinese author Cixin Liu. What I find interesting is that the books start with a Chinese scientist in the Cultural Revolution. She's traumatized by her father getting beaten to death by his physics students. We're talking about Einstein's theory of general relativity, which you see is a dangerous Western reactionary theory that goes counter to China's Marxist whatever. Anyway, the point is her trauma from the Cultural Revolution leads her to set off a chain of events that leads to, let's just say, much, much bigger problems. Because that's pretty realistic. I can't wait to see how Netflix handles the 3-body problem. Maybe a watch party is a good idea. You can sit with me for 12 hours. Thanks for your question. And thank you to everyone else who supports China Uncensored through Locals. Join Locals as a paying member and you'll get a lot of cool perks, including me answering your questions on the show. Check out ChinaUncensored.locals.com. This is Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching China Uncensored.
In life, man. In death, love.
Protests, political backstabbing, and sheer utter mayhem. Those are just a few of the biggest stories to come out of China in 2022. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Well, it's been another year and still no apocalypse. For many, that's a win, but for me, who put a lot of money on 2012 being the end of the world, it's still a bit of a sore spot. Turns out living every day like it's your last isn't great financial advice. But 2022 was also a big year in China. A lot of things happened, things that could change China and the world forever. So to wrap up 2022, let's take a look back at the 10 biggest China stories of the year. Number 10, Chinese police stations everywhere. Chinese police have such a wonderful reputation for care and compassion. That's why countries around the world were thrilled to learn that China had been secretly establishing police stations in other countries. Over 100 of them in 53 countries, including the US. This was about as exciting as discovering you have scurvy. Yeah, this saves so much time brushing my teeth. Why was China sending police to other countries? Well, after it came out China was secretly doing this, the official explanation was they were there to catch scammers and help overseas Chinese process legal debt. But according to the human rights NGO Safeguard Defenders, these police stations were actually part of a campaign to pressure Chinese citizens to return to China, supposedly to face justice for crimes they had committed in China or abroad. Essentially, it's like Taken, but if Liam Neeson were the villain. In other words, they were just harassing overseas Chinese people who got on the bad side of the party. And let's just say this year, a lot of overseas Chinese people got on the bad side of the party. More on that later in the countdown. And if you want to learn more about this or any of the other stories I'm talking about today, I have links to full episodes in the description below. And on to number 9, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine had a big impact on China. But let me give you just a little bit of a pre-invasion timeline so you can see China's hand in it. Months before the invasion, the US government was warning it was going to happen and tried to convince Chinese officials thinking they could help stop it. The Chinese officials totally dismissed what the US had said. I know, who could have seen that coming? Chinese officials then turned around and gave all the information the US gave them to Russia and told Moscow China would not try to impede Russia's plans and actions. Weeks before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Xi Jinping met with Vladimir Putin ahead of the Beijing Winter Olympics. After that meeting, China and Russia released a joint statement saying that China-Russia friendship has no limits and there are no forbidden areas of cooperation. Reports came out that China actually asked Russia to delay the invasion until after the Beijing Olympics were over. And yet, just days before the invasion, China was still saying the U.S. was exaggerating the Russian threat to Ukraine. For those of you who think China mainly uses coal to power everything, this proves they're also experts at using gaslighting. No matter how the war between Russia and Ukraine goes, the Chinese Communist Party plans to be the winner. And they're doing that by turning Russia into North Korea. What I mean is, for years, China was seen as the only go-between for North Korea and the rest of the world. They want that with Russia. As the Washington Post says, China is believed to have more influence over Russia than any other country due to the nation's growing security and economic ties. China says it's ready to play a role in a Ukraine ceasefire. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine also has a lot of people making comparisons between China's threats to invade Taiwan, which the Chinese Communist Party is not happy about. More on that after the break.
Wow.
Hey!
Welcome back. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has made a lot of people take China's threat to invade Taiwan a lot more seriously. Which brings me to the next big China story of the year. Number 8. Nancy Pelosi visits Taiwan. In August, then Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. During her trip, she met with the president of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, and Pelosi had one main message: the U.S. supports Taiwan.
Today, the world faces a choice between democracy and autocracy. America's determination to preserve democracy here in Taiwan and around the world remains ironclad. And now, more than ever, America's solidarity with Taiwan is crucial And that is the message we are bringing here today.
This is part of a growing international wave of support. Taiwan is a thriving democracy and also a pretty important economic player. Most of the world's advanced semiconductors. For decades, the Chinese Communist Party has threatened today. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has made a lot of people think, you know what, maybe we should support Taiwan now instead of waiting for a Chinese invasion and then hanging up Taiwanese flags on our porches. Mainly because there's a pretty good chance those Taiwanese flags will be made in China, so you'd just be helping them. Speaking of, number 7, Biden unveils his China policy. After a year and a half, President Biden finally released his China policy. And it's pretty confusing. Secretary of State Antony Blinken unveiled that policy in May. And there were strong points. Blinken called out China's human rights violations and even said the Chinese regime was committing genocide.
The United States stands with people around the world against the genocide and crimes against humanity happening in the Xinjiang region, where more than 1 million people have been placed in detention camps because of their ethnic and religious identity.
So what is the U.S. going to do about that?
We'll continue to raise these issues and call for change, not to stand against China, but to stand up for peace, security, and human dignity.
Oh, okay. Call for change. That'll help. This would be like a cop witnessing a murder spree and saying, hey, if you don't knock that off, I'm going to ask a little less politely next time. The Chinese Communist Party is a regime that uses rape as a form of torture. I don't think telling them that's wrong is really going to work. But the Biden administration's China policy is very clear about one thing. It doesn't want conflict with China.
There's no reason why our great nations cannot coexist peacefully and share and contribute to human progress together.
Oh, I think there is a reason, and that reason is the Chinese Communist Party. You know, it's not a great negotiating tactic to let someone know that there are no consequences to what they're doing. That's like a parent telling their child, if you don't stop putting centipedes in your sister's hair, I'm still going to buy you ice cream. But even though Blinken's speech came off as a little optimistic about the Chinese Communist Party, the Biden administration has also done some historically tough things to counter China this year, like choking off China's access to critical semiconductor technology. This was huge. So I'm not saying Biden's China policy has been all bad, but what I'm worried about is this. There are always going to be U.S. officials and influential business people trying to push the U.S. government to appease the Chinese Communist Party. They won't call it that. They'll call it working together with China or engaging with China. Because surely the U.S. can make the Chinese Communist Party see reason if they just give in to them a little more. Just think of all the money U.S. businesses can make in China. Yeah, that's worked out horribly for the last 20 plus years, but people are still going to push for it. Let's just ignore that China considers America its #1 enemy. That might not matter, though, because big changes are happening inside China, no matter how much Wall Street wants to invest in a genocidal regime. And that brings us to number 6, mortgage protests. It's been a big year for protests in China. Over the summer, homeowners started to boycott their mortgage payments. You see, real estate is one of the only investments you can make in China, which is a shame because if you could invest in the odds of the Communist Party lying and committing atrocities, you'd make enough money to offset losing that bet about 2012 being the end of the world. But you can't, so the real estate sector is huge. So huge it makes up 30% of China's GDP. During the real estate boom, people bought homes while they were still under construction, mostly apartments in big complexes like this. 90% of new homes in China are pre-sold. 90%. The problem is big real estate developers like Evergrande ran out of money and never finished construction. That's like paying for a hamburger and they can't get it to you because the cow is still on the loose somewhere. But the people who bought those unfinished homes still had to pay off their mortgages. That's right, they were paying for homes that didn't exist until they started holding protests and boycotting their mortgage payments. The Chinese Communist Party is trying to solve this debt crisis by issuing even more debt. Kind of like fighting fire with fire, but in a gas station. China's central bank is mobilizing $148 billion to bail out these real estate projects. And this is putting a major strain on an already strained economy. Coming up after the break, the top 5 biggest stories of the year. Welcome back. Let's carry on with the absolute biggest China stories of the year. Starting with number 5, the death of Jiang Zemin. The death of Jiang Zemin was a long time coming. The guy was 96 years old. It just goes to show only the good die young. He died of leukemia and multiple organ failure. Ironic for the guy who set up China's system of forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience. Jiang Zemin became the leader of the Chinese Communist Party following the Tiananmen, which really was the perfect overture for a guy who would go on to commit even more crimes against humanity. Though many Western media remembered him as a reformer. Why?
Do you have an audience?
Because he allowed foreign investment in China. So after coming to power for supporting a massacre the entire world saw, and then implementing even more genocidal practices, Jiang Zemin thought, now is the time to invite Westerners to join us. That's one of the craziest business moves I've ever seen. Crazier still, it worked. Quick, triple your investment in a genocidal regime. But Jiang Zemin was also the head of a political faction that was at war with current Chinese leader Xi Jinping. And that's not just something we've covered in a single episode or two. We have a whole playlist devoted to this power struggle. What I've been calling the people's favorite communist soap opera, General Hostility. And since this was such a giant soap opera, I wouldn't be surprised to learn that Jiang faked his own death, or that it was actually his evil twin brother. Find out on future episodes of General Hostility. Remember, links to all of these episodes are in the description. Moving on to number 4, Presentator for Life. This year, Communist Party leader Xi Jinping essentially declared himself leader for life. Not quite a president, not quite a dictator, what I call a presentator. In October, a meeting of top Communist Party leaders happened, like it does every 5 years. This time, it was the 20th National Party Congress. And Xi Jinping officially got another 5-year term in power. Although the party puts on a show of this being a vote, the reality is, the outcome of the Party Congress is determined through years of power struggle. And despite some media saying this was norm-breaking, Xi Jinping is really just following a proud Communist Party tradition. Mao Zedong was leader for life. After he died, his successor, Deng Xiaoping, ruled for the rest of his life. Jiang Zemin took power after the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, and even though he officially stepped down in 2002, he still wielded tremendous power behind the scenes 3 years after that, including holding on to control of the military. Hu Jintao was the only person to be limited to 2 5-year terms, largely because Jiang Zemin was really in charge, until Xi Jinping came to power in 2012 and began his war against Jiang. But just because he's presentator for life doesn't mean it's all going to be smooth sailing, because Xi's rise was overshadowed by some other major events. Like number 3, Hu Jintao got purged? I'm sure Xi Jinping would have preferred his rise to be the main story of the 20th Party Congress, but what actually captured everyone's attention was this. Former leader Hu Jintao seemingly being unceremoniously hauled out of the room. It's kind of like bridezillas screaming at a drunk uncle for ruining their special moment. The world basically went nuts over that. Many viewed it as a Stalinist purge. And Xi Jinping has definitely been purging his political opponents over the years, but usually much more quietly and behind closed doors. That's why I think there was actually something else going on here. The details are really too much to go into here, so I recommend checking out the full episode we did. Again, I'll put a link in the description below. And now, number 2, Shanghai locked down. China enforced a harsh zero-COVID policy for most of the pandemic. And this past April, Shanghai, one of the largest, most prosperous cities in China, went into full lockdown as part of zero COVID. Earlier, party officials promised Shanghai would not go into full lockdown. But then they locked down Shanghai for 2 months. Starting to think the government that told everyone not to worry, Russia definitely wouldn't invade Ukraine, isn't the most trustworthy. I'm using what happened in Shanghai as a microcosm of all of the horror of China's zero-COVID policy. There were cover-ups of cases and deaths, food shortages, and people being dragged away to quarantine camps. This was the pattern that emerged in dozens of Chinese cities over the past few years. And zero-COVID created economic havoc, as large parts of the Chinese economy were shut down. Well, it turns out all those investors trying to triple their profits by doing business with a genocidal regime might not have thought this out that well. Some said that zero-COVID policy could have a greater impact on global economy than Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And all these lockdowns were creating tremendous unrest. Which brings us to the biggest China story of the year. Number 1, lockdown protests. In November, an apartment fire killed at least 10 people in Xinjiang, but probably much more. The death toll was so high, at least partly because zero-COVID rules kept firefighters from being able to respond in time. People in China saw what happened in Xinjiang and knew that it could happen to them too. And so massive protests erupted around China. Years of zero-COVID had been a pressure cooker, and it finally erupted. These were the biggest protests in China since 1989. Now, protests actually happen pretty frequently in China. It turns out living under an authoritarian, genocidal regime gives people a few things to nitpick over.